Hey everybody, it is day 7. That means we're in Matthew chapter 7. Now, Matthew chapter 7 is still considered in the Sermon on the Mount. So everything he's been talking about in chapter 5 and chapter 6, this is just a continuation of what he's been talking about. And we see in chapter 7 in verse 1, probably the most misquoted verse of all times, right? Judge not that you will be judged. You hear this a whole lot as a Christian, and you normally don't hear this from Christians. You hear this from the world, right? You hear it from people who don't know Scripture, right? You can't judge me. Only God can judge me. But that doesn't mean as Christians we don't have a choice. This doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to look and to perceive some things. When it says to judge not, that word judge, that means the word, it's the Greek word krino. And that word krino means to punish or to condemn, right? So Jesus is saying that we cannot punish and we cannot condemn people. That is God's job, right? Only God can punish and condemn people eternally. But as Christians, we can judge, not condemn or punish, but we can look at things and look at what people are living, how people are acting, by the words, by the fruit that they're bearing, and make some decisions and make some godly choices in what does that mean for us. And so the rest of chapter 7 is kind of giving you explanation on this idea, right? That in this idea, we shouldn't judge. And it goes into this idea of saying that, why do you see the speck in your brother's eye when there is a log in your own, right? That word speck is simply the word a splinter. He says, how can you see a splinter in your brother's eye when you have a beam or a timber in your eye, right? And so basically what it's saying is a lot of times people will say that we're magnifying it. We're looking at the small things of other people's life. We're looking at some small sins and problems in other people's life when we don't see the old sin in our life. And that's true. Sometimes a lot of Christians do this. We see this a lot with the Pharisees, hypocrisy, all those things kind of happen. But what Jesus is pointing out is this idea of really ultimately this condemn, this punishment. And that's why he goes in verse 6 and he says, don't let the dogs, don't give to the dogs what is holy. Don't give your pearls to the swine. Pearls was pretty much the most important jewel back then. And so basically what he's saying is don't give what is the best to those who are the worst. Now, Jesus is not saying don't share the gospel with people. It's not what he's saying at all. All throughout his scripture, we're to share gospel with everybody. What he's saying is people who are dogs, not the dog that you have on your couch, but wild, unruly dogs that would roam the desert and roam caravans and just pick and they would never be domesticated. Pigs who are the epitome of uncleanliness, who are nasty, who will never be good, right? He's saying somebody who you share the gospel with somebody and they don't want to hear the gospel. They turn away from the gospel. They're always going to be wild. They're always going to be unruly, right? He's saying don't just keep with them. Don't give them what is holy. Don't give them what is just. Don't just focus on them, but we are to move on, right? We see the words of Jesus, right? To shake the dust off of his feet, and he walked out of towns for people who do not accept the gospel. In Acts chapter 18, we see this idea the disciples are going and sharing the gospel, and he comes out and they say the blood will be on your heads, right? People who rejected the gospel, we're just called to share the gospel and to keep moving. And so this idea is we're not defining judgment. We're not punishing people. We're telling them the gospel, but ultimately they get to make the decision. And that's what the rest of chapter 7 is about, right? Ask and it will be given. What are you ultimately, as a Christian, what are you asking for? Is it something for you? Is it something for God? We get to the golden rule, right? Treat others as you want yourself to be treated, right? These are good things, and these are normal things, but this is really the hypocrisy of the day. The religious elite would not do that. They were making these divine judgments. All Gentiles were going to hell. All Gentiles were unworthy of God, and so they were putting them place in the judgment chair of God. And so Jesus comes down and says, hey, we're not going to do this, right? This is wrong. It's not your place to judge. Only God can judge, and we're to do these things. And he goes on and he gives some other things, right? A tree and its fruit, right? We can tell by a tree if it's a good tree, if it's a bad tree. If it's giving good fruit, it's a good, healthy tree. But if it's giving bad fruit, rotten fruit, well, there's something wrong with the tree, right? There's something wrong. There's a root disease. There's a pest, an insect that's invaded the tree. There's problems with the tree. As Christians, we can look on to people, whether they are saved or whether they are not saved, and be able to determine with the Spirit inside of us if they are a good tree or if they are a bad tree, right? If you want to do that. So we can make judgments by looking at somebody and seeing if they are good, if they are bad, their fruits are good or bad, but we cannot judge ultimately and say those people are going to heaven or to hell. We are to share the gospel with them. If they reject the gospel, we're to move on, right? It continues on. And where it just uses this idea, it says, I never knew you. Verses 21 through 23, this idea of saying, just because you're doing good works doesn't mean you're getting into heaven, right? And that's kind of the story. It's not about the works. It's not about the fruit. It's ultimately about what's inside. But we can't see the inside. But the only way that we can get a perception of the inside is by the outside. And we finish with kind of the ultimate Sunday school story, right? We have the house is built on the sand and the rock. Here's what's interesting about the story that I think we forget. Both of these people, the wise man and the foolish man, they both heard the gospel, right? They both built a house. They both were near each other because they felt the same storm. But what happened? Well, the house fell that wasn't built on the rock. It was the foundation. Both people built a house. It was probably the same house with the same materials, but it was all about the foundation. It doesn't matter if it's good works. It doesn't matter if it's bad works. People build their houses, and as Christians, we're called to share the gospel to everyone, whether they have a house on the rock or a house on the sand, because we ultimately do not know. We are not the ultimate judge, but we can make some ideas and some hypothesis on their fruit, right? So we're not the ultimate judge, but we can judge according to their fruit. But all people should hear the gospel. Guys, God bless, and we'll see you tomorrow on day 8.